What's up, Sega fans? It's the Sega guys here with me, Dan the Mega Driver, and my good friend James the Segaholic. How you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thank you very much, mate. How's yourself?
Yeah, very good. And it's been a very interesting week and a half, 2 weeks. I mean, we had the Xbox news, and then we had the leaked document that came out, and we've got the episode of Shura at the time of recording, what we have already recorded, with the episode going out, a week Monday. But the Sega retro news keeps coming with the very surprising
where did you start?
Irimajiri interview that got translated. Now he did this back in 2022, I believe, James. Yeah. And it's just been translated, I think, on Sega 16.
It's MDShock.com.
MDShock. Yeah, they're great as well. We reference them a lot in the Saturn years, and some real bombshells in there, mate.
Yeah, I mean, obviously on this kind of show we don't tend to kind of refer to notes. We kind of pride ourselves in being the unscripted, unrehearsed Sega podcast, but for this here we've had to take some stuff down because there's a hell of a lot here. Shoichiro Irimajiri, it was a lecture series at Forum Management for Tomorrow, and it was the 5th lecture in that series, held on October 20th 2022, and it focused on Irimajiri-san's time at Sega in the 90s. And he's went into everything. He's went into the Saturn design, the 32X, SEGA of America's finances, Tom Kalinske being asked to step down, just tons of stuff in there. So we've kind of picked out kind of 4 key areas of it that we're going to look at. I say, because we've got that buffer, mate, we literally, again, could not sit on this for like 6 weeks. Stuff like this has to be spoken about, I think, given what we do and things. To react to this is the only thing we can do. So that's what we're going to do today, is get into these kind of 4 quite meaty bits of information.
Indeed. And it is kind of a reaction video, and I cringe a little bit when I say it's a reaction video. Maybe we're on the thumbnail, we'll be like, oh. But
we need what?
But it is, and it's quite interesting because we're a retro slanted podcast. Although we do cover some modern Sega stuff, it's quite good to react to stuff like that. I mean, we did the Mega Drive Mini 2 video, which again was sort of concurrent news at the time that we did a video kind of like this one. This isn't one of our usual podcast series, so I don't know, mate. Maybe this is something we'll see more and more. If it goes there, if people enjoy seeing us react to some of the Sega news that's out there, it's not going to be over dramatized. People know us by now. We're just going to talk from the way that we see it and offer our view on it. But it's an interesting time being able to react to the news like this. But mate, should we just jump straight into it? What was the first big meaty nugget that you got down here?
Yeah, so the first thing was obviously the Saturn design, and again, I'm just going to refer to the kind of notes that I've taken down. So, Irimajiri-san says that when it came to Sega's next generation machine, their view was that the console had to bring something new and different to the market, such as 3D graphics. However, there was an opinion that they could make even greater 2D games, with more colour, better animation, and that such a console would specialise, and this is quoted, specialise in upgraded 2D graphics. Irimajiri-san also says that opinions were split on the matter. So before the system is even a reality, we're already now looking at Sega being internally conflicted, much like we've already, how often have we spoken about Sega being internally conflicted on here? He says that without a clear decision being made, the design featured both the ability to do, and this is the quote here, a limited amount of 3D graphics and the highest level, a limited amount of 3D graphics and the highest level of 2D graphics. So essentially Saturn was a more 2D focused machine. He's kind of not confirming it, but he's alluding to the fact that the 3D aspect was limited. And then if we look at what Hideki Sato had said in that Sega 16 interview that we've mentioned on here before, you've used it, for Saturn year zero, that when Saturn was being designed, the industry was in transition from sprites to CG. He states that the arcades had System 22 pushing 300,000 sprites and the Model 1 pushing a significant number of polygons. So in order to not lose the assets and the accumulated experience that they had, they basically initially thought that Saturn would be, based on System 22, but they acknowledged, or Sato acknowledged, that inevitably they would have to embrace that kind of polygonal future. And that's when that both 2D and 3D were included. However, and this is a line here, and you sent me the kind of the screenshot of this part from that interview where Sato says it was done in the spirit of having both, but felt like we were splitting the baby and not doing justice to either. So, I mean, I'll put it back to you, mate, before I kind of bring up key points. But I mean, what was your kind of take? Was there anything a bit more revealing on top of what you already thought or knew?
It kind of confirmed what I'd already felt, especially when you contrast it with what Sato said. Irimajiri would have been fairly fresh into the company at the time. He came over from Honda, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That he came over. And yeah, I think there's this perception that the Saturn was only focused on 2D. And you hear it a lot when people talk about the Saturn's biggest problem is that it couldn't do 2D. The Saturn wasn't designed to do 3D. It does kind of confirm, if you take Irimajiri's words at face value, that it was primarily a 2D machine aimed at pushing 2D development even further. But he does admit that there were fundamental 3D elements in there. And as Sato said, Sato seems to think it was kind of 50-50. Irimajiri seems to make it seem like it's 70-30 or 80-20.
Yeah.
I think, and I think we said as much in year zero, when we recorded that back in 2021, when the Sato interview came out. And I don't think this changes that, really. We talk in that with year zero about the fact that what was out in the market at that time was the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar.
Yep.
And even at a base value, you'd expect the Saturn, even just using one SH2, I think the expectation was the Saturn would be, better than or at least on par with those machines. This kind of suggests that. I think we said at the time maybe it could do a rudimentary version of Virtua Fighter, akin to the 32X version, which came out later. I think they kind of put pain to that because I think somewhere else in that interview it says that Virtua Fighter might not have been possible in the machine as it was then. But it'll be interesting if that really was the view, given that Virtua Fighter was such a big hit for them. They were already looking at the SVP chip for the Mega Drive, because I mean, in terms of timescales, the SVP was before the 32X in terms of development. They knew that market was there and that hunger for those arcade ports were there. So you've got to, I still believe they could have done a rudimentary port of Virtua Fighter. And I think they probably did have just enough in there. So I don't think this changes much, but it kind of vindicates what we were saying at the time.
I mean, the thing as well is that we've still not got to where, in the next bit we will get to that, where they add that second SH2.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting, obviously, down the line, the 32X would go on to get the two SH2s, which would imagine is what helped that to do a port of Virtua Fighter, but they were saying that originally, and I'm pretty sure I've taken it down, as it is later on in that interview, that as the Saturn stood at that time, it wouldn't have been able to do Virtua Fighter. So it's kind of, I mean, it doesn't alter kind of too much. Just I think a lot of people might latch on to that kind of thing where they do mention the focus on more, that it was doing top end 2D with a little bit of 3D. But the argument has always kind of been from people that have kind of peddled the myth that Saturn was designed as a 2D machine, so that there was, rudimentary, basic 3D capabilities being built in. So to say it was designed as a 2D machine is patently false. It has obviously had that ability for 3D in there, and it was expanded on. But the kind of key points that I had down for it was, even at design stage, Sega was conflicted. They went ahead with that design, even though opinions were split. Is it a case of being afraid to let go of the past to build a truly future-proof system? They already mentioned that they originally thought about basing it on System 22, that, Sato said that, we were at a transitional period between sprites and CG/3D. So is it maybe just we've alluded to it before on here, that perhaps being at that kind of crossroads point was almost detrimental. And, to the victors come the spoils, as they say, but Sony took the bet on all 3D and left Sega essentially catching up on the decision. They were trying to kind of hedge their bets, maybe sitting on the fence a wee bit, a bit of this, a bit of that. And as Sato said, they included both, but really did neither justice. And I thought that might have been a bit harsh to say they did neither justice, because let's not allow this to paint the Saturn as being some botched job Frankenstein inferior system here, because I think there's a danger that actually ends up happening. To say that did neither justice, look at Sega Rally, look at Virtua Cop, look at VF2, look at Last Bronx, Panzer Dragoon, look at the 2D stuff, Astol, the X-Men versus Street Fighter stuff, even with the 4 meg RAM cut. Take that away. Street Fighter Alpha 2, there's so much great stuff on there. Yes, it was hard to program. We know that. But I think that line from Sato maybe kind of does it. It does more injustice to the Saturn in general, I think. So we can't let this kind of stuff already add to the kind of bastardization of the Saturn's reputation. You know what I mean? It's like,
I know, and I think that it does seem like they're trying to appease all, and it does seem like there was some trepidation within the industry. I think if you look at where the industry at the time, 3D polygonal games were the denizen of one. You had the SNES Super FX chips, which were very rudimentary, but that was working at 14 to 16 frames per second. A lot of it was handled by Mode 7, and then you've got the arcade world, which is the high end stuff, and now 3D was the denizen of that. Now, if you look at if you go back and play Virtua Fighter now, you play Virtua Racing now, the Switch port of Virtua Racing shows how well that holds up.
Yep.
The stuff that was in the arcades really holds up. The very early 3D exclusive stuff, your PlayStation Warhawks, your Game Wars on the Saturn, Black Dawn, all that sort of the very first 3D stuff to Shinden, like the console specific stuff, is not great. And I think maybe, and it doesn't hold up well. And this is on the PlayStation Saturn and N64 side. Then it's a very experimental. And part of me has always thought that Sega kind of saw the limitations of home console 3D, and I think developers saw that too. Not only was it difficult, it was new, and they'd had a lot of success with it. Like, let the 3D high-end stuff sit in the arcade until it's ready to come home. And I think it's that Sega didn't think it was there. PlayStation found a way to make it appealing. And as we come onto your next point that you've got in there, mate, and great work putting all these together in a really concise way, by the way. But when we come to the next point, I think that really shows where the industry was moving and why this kind of moved so quickly.
But don't forget, mate, Bernie Stoller said that Toshinden was sexy.
Indeed. Oh, dear. Says more about him than us.
Well, there we go. I mean, the next part we've got, mate, is I've called this post-PlayStation reveal. Okay, so again, Irimajiri-san says that when he joined Sega in '93, and again, I think that's a key point as well. He also alludes to the fact that he didn't know much about the games industry when he came in. So again, how much of this is he actually seen at that time that he wasn't overly knowledgeable about? He was still kind of learning on the job, but we've got to take what he says at face value. So he says when he joined Sega in 1993, Sony unveiled the 3D capabilities of the PlayStation, saying its 3D performance was near level with Virtua Racing. High praise indeed. They learned, they being Sega, that many third-party developers were shifting their focus from developing using 3D graphics and had abandoned 2D game development in favour of 3D. Quote here says, Saturn's CPU could not handle the heavy processing required to create 3D graphics. A possibility was to add a GPU, a graphics chip, that could specialise in handling heavy graphics calculations. However, it was far too late to begin development on something like that, so it was decided to use a second SH2 in place of a GPU. So the first thing I wanted to do, mate, was kind of double down on the kind of semantics that we've seen at play here, because some have argued that the term GPU wasn't used back then, or doesn't mean back then what it does today. But Irimajiri-san clearly refers to it as a graphics chip. So he also clearly differentiates between GPU and CPU. He clearly makes that differentiation there. Let's not forget that Tom Kalinske had taken a potential deal for the use of silicon graphics to SOJ. That would eventually go on to power the graphics of the N64. So again, that's a graphical chipset. Graphical chipsets existed. VDP 1 and 2 are graphical chipsets.
Yep.
It might not be a GPU in terms of your SoC or graphics card that you see today, but the terminology was still clearly there.
Yeah, so, there's a clear delineation between what the two things do.
Yeah. So, the key points I had from that, mate, is that, the transition that Sato spoke about from, sprites to 3D and CG had now tipped. As I said before, Sega's decision to sit on that fence had kind of backfired. But this was the one that really got me, mate. And when I sent this to you, I think your eyes lit up at it a wee bit as well. Did developers really abandon 2D games just like that? Bear in mind, Irimajiri says it was 1993 whenever they saw PS1's 3D performance on par with Virtua Racing. We know that a lot of developers were turned off by the high cost of developing 3D games initially on PlayStation. Sony had a very expensive development kit, custom development kit that was obviously designed on their kind of high-end workstations. And it wasn't until CES in 1994 that SN Systems produced and showcased a cheaper PC-based development kit to Sony, which prompted Sony to drop their own internal development kit, order 600,000 of these from SN Systems, and buy Psygnosis to get their hands on them. So that was kind of one point that I thought that it might just be that his timeline might be out, but I don't think that 1993, all of a sudden you've seen this. Look, it was still great 2D games coming out. It's not as if they all just dropped everything in 1993 on seeing what PlayStation was doing. So whether it's his timeline, I'm not sure, but that was one that kind of jumped out at me because, as I say, that doesn't line up with the CES and the new development kits in 94.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think Sony had already bought Psygnosis and SN Systems before the dev kits came out. From my memory, I think they bought Psygnosis and then they gave out the first dev kits, and then that was when SN Systems said these are terrible.
Right.
And yeah, I don't think this mass adoption of 3D became as exciting for developers until after that moment. So it may be that Irimajiri, I mean, this is the thing about a lot of this stuff. I mean, you're always going to get. I mean, people are taking a lot of this at face value, which is fine. People can interpret it how they want, but at the end of the day, it's kind of the real detail behind this is just an interpretation. These are events that happened 30 years ago, and these are, we were just talking just now about the Saturn's 2D focus versus 3D focus, how Irimajiri's words compared to Sato's words when talking about the same system. Where one, this is their memory from 30 years ago. Two, this is translated and the quality of the translation may be in question. So there's all sorts of things going on there. I mean, myself, we're recording this as we're about to record a Sonic episode, and one thing that I always thought in my head is that I played a certain game in the summer of 1991. An investigation of that game, I've realised it didn't come out until the winter, so so I didn't play it until 1992. That by the by, but using that as an example, it's quite possible that Irimajiri got his years kind of confused there. I mean, he's had a long and like Sega, extremely eventful tenure at Sega, so it's possible. But I think in terms of the events, it did happen. The timeline might be a little bit out, but you did see that support for 3D from developers really coming to force in PlayStation. And PlayStation really, I think it was Sony Computer Entertainment America that had the mandatory, your game has to be 3D. And although there were some exceptions, they really wanted everything to be 3D. So they were pushing the market, and Sega had to respond. And that's when they added the second processor. And yeah, we've said it in year zero. Again, we recorded that a couple of years ago before any of this or the documents came out. Same with year one, which is yet to air on our channel at the time I recorded. But it's uploaded. It's around in podcast form. But we've always said it is a second processor, the second CPU, not a VDP, not a GPU. And a lot of channels always say, yeah, Sega added a graphical processor at the last minute. And this confirms again that they didn't. And this is Irimajiri that's confirmed it, and Saturn that said that they both said the same thing. And whether it's semantics or not, I don't think it is. I don't think you can say, oh, well, by GPU I meant CPU. I mean, yes, the marketing for the Saturn was 8 processors. The guy holding the Saturn box and flexing and stuff.
Sorry, PlayStation.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think that this just kind of confirms, again, confirming kind of what we already knew. But a lot of this, I remember when I watched Panda's breakdown, the 3-hour video, which kind of had me hooked for all 3 hours when he went through the document. At the beginning, he said, someone I think must have asked in the chat how he felt, and he says, vindicated. And I think this kind of vindicates a lot of what, the Saturn community have thought for quite a while.
Aye. And I think what you said there as well, mate, just to kind of quickly go back, because I think that is important, that we're asking, gentlemen that are in their 60s, 70s now to relive and recall events from 3 decades ago. You know, so like I can't remember what I done 6 months ago, mate. Like, and I'm 44. So if my memory's half as good as these guys when I'm 74, I'll be happy. It's like it's the same whenever you hear like kind of Tom gets criticised in a lot of kind of like forums and Twitter as well. And you've got to remember it's like the meetings and the brands and the launches and the cancellations and all the things these guys work on. Their minds must be like Scrabble.
No, I know.
The amount of information. So you are right. You've got to cut a wee bit of slack here because they're doing their best to recall decades-long events. So, but I think vindicated is right, mate. I think that was one of the massive bugbears. I know Saturn Dave, it's a massive bugbear it has as well, this whole second GPU thing. And it's the way it's worded, at the last minute, they threw an extra graphical processor in there. And it doesn't matter if the reason behind them putting it in was to aid with the 3D calculations. It's as if that somehow like gives them a pass because the extra processor was put in to help with processing 3D graphics. It's still not a graphics processor.
Yeah, I think the reason why it's always bugged me is the narrative shifts to something that's slightly different, and that's why I wanted to make the point in the previous note quite clear. Is that the Saturn could always do 3D. And a lot of people say, and I think that's the narrative that people misunderstand, or the false narrative that they try to push for whatever reason. Maybe that makes things sound more dramatic, but it's wrong. Is the fact that they say that the Saturn couldn't do 3D rather, and it needed a new graphical processor to do 3D. So it's like, it can't do polygons, so they crammed something in that could do polygons, which is wrong. And that's why this needs to be validated and called out. It's not that it couldn't do 3D and it needed a new chip to do something it couldn't already do. It could do 3D, but it couldn't do it as well as the PlayStation. So instead of giving it new capability, all they did was add another processor to augment what it already did. And there's a very clear delineation between those two things, and that's why it's always bugs me, and I think it's always bugged you as well, because they're two completely different things. It's a completely different narrative. One says it couldn't do it, so they put something in it could, but the truth is it could do it, but they put something in to make it better, and they're two different things. So hopefully all this noise, anyone that actually does a bit of research into this now, any post-Saturn documentaries or anything like that anyone wants to put together, there's enough information out there now to get your facts right. It could do 3D, just not very well, or not as well as the PlayStation. Probably around 3DO levels, but that's why I think it's important.
No, absolutely, mate. And as you said before, it's this has to be told correctly going on, because
absolutely,
as decades pass and content creators move on, come and go, and obviously I was speaking on Twitter to a few people, and when I was accused of getting upset about it, it's like, it's not upset. There's nothing wrong with being passionate. Ironically, someone I was speaking to is also very passionate about, digital distribution versus physical and the loss of the physical form of games. I'm no different with this.
Yeah.
It's information has to be captured correctly and historically, because like we didn't know at the time. We were living history. The way retro gaming has boomed, the way the industry has grown, that this is all now part of the history, the legacy of a much larger business. And
Yeah,
you can't just go, it's semantics. It needs to be captured correctly. So you're right, what you said there, mate. It could do 3D. It couldn't do it as well as the PlayStation. Nothing was thrown in to make it do something it couldn't already do. It was just to give it that extra bit of grunt in terms of carrying out the calculations to do 3D better. So
absolutely.
if you're creating a why the Saturn failed or the history of Saturn video, and you say they threw an extra graphics processor in at the last moment to compete with the Sony PlayStation, no, they didn't.
Oh, but yeah, I think again, validating. I think that one again, not telling us anything that we didn't know, but it's good to have it validated. But I think the next point was quite interesting. So yeah, if you want to go through what the next point was.
Oh, mate, I'll do my best because this is, I think, the longest one that I've taken
Yeah.
down, right, which was the 32X and SEGA of America. So Irimajiri-san said that SOA didn't want to go that way. That's a quote. And by that way, new console. And he flew to the US to meet Tom Kalinske and Joe Miller, who told him that there is no way they could abandon the incredible success of the Genesis, going on to say, they made this clear to me in a very passionate manner. He continues, we would release the Saturn in Japan at the end of 1994. Meanwhile, we would develop an enhancer for the Genesis, the 32X, that SEGA of America would release at the end of 1994. Irimajiri also goes on to call it a huge strategic blunder that would cost us heavily until the very end. That's an understatement. The wording suggests that Tom and Joe passionately defended the replacement of the Genesis with Saturn and persuaded Irimajiri to get SOJ to develop the 32X for them. Now, we've got testimony from the same MDShock.com article from Hayo Nakayama regarding the 32X. And I've put some bits in bold because it kind of not so much contradicts, but kind of maybe goes hand in hand with what Irimajiri said. He said that a lot of the discussions with SEGA of America about this came to the conclusion that it would be worth using the huge customer base of the Genesis rather than switch to Saturn. This makes it sound a lot less dramatic than I think Irimajiri made it sound. He paints a picture of Tom and Joe just downright refusing to shift from Genesis, although there may be truth in that to a degree because Tom is on record as saying we should have stayed with Genesis another year. That quote is mentioned on Classic Gaming Quarterly's video,
Yeah.
The History of Sega Saturn. That's actually a quote that he's lifted and he's sourced it, so it's on there. But when you hear Tom saying obviously about, we should have stayed with Genesis another year, this is back in obviously what, 93, 94?
Yeah.
You look at the retail figures from fiscal year 97 and the leaks, and you see that Sega of America were having to buy back bulk unsold Genesis, probably Game Gear, Sega CD, 32X stock at a huge loss. That wasn't the right decision ultimately. But Nakayama also says that Sega of America insisted consumers could not afford a new console. The whole $399 price tag, they balked at that and said that it would be cheaper to do the add-on with the Genesis to do kind of pseudo Saturn performance almost. And it says that SOG finally relented on 32X, which then sort of goes back to what Irimajiri said, that maybe they were kind of pleading their case and just downright putting their foot down and saying, no, we don't want it. And SEGA of Japan have just had to go, right, fine. The goodwill built up from the years of Genesis doing well, although in hindsight, perhaps not as well financially as we believed. But key points from that one is deviation from proven strategy, releasing in Japan and the US a year apart. Splitting the market was catastrophic. I don't think anybody can deny that.
No.
The gaming world and media were far more informed in the mid-90s. Now, I'm not going to steal Saturn Dave's point here because this was a tweet he put out and it was an angle I didn't really think of at the time, but he's right. The globalization of gaming media was well underway. Gamers in the West were very, very aware of Japan. what was going on. And, gamers here were excited. It was exotic to gamers over here. The games ran faster, they came out sooner. What's new? The import scene was beginning to bubble under the surface. People wanted games from Japan. So that globalization of gaming news, the kind of lack of awareness around that, to think that, yeah, okay, we'll do this strategy where we'll let you do 32X and Genesis and we'll do Saturn for a year. To think that consumers over here weren't going to get switched on to what's happening in Japan is madness. Was it perhaps selfish of Sega of America to use that goodwill in the bank from the success of Genesis to maybe persuade SOJ to listen to their plans? What Tom had done had worked. He had goodwill in the bank with Nakayama. We recall the meeting that Tom had where Nakayama kicked his chair up because Tom wanted to drop the price, hack in Sonic. And he said, when I brought you in, I told you could run the American division, so do things your way, and it worked. Was that goodwill perhaps to the detriment? Obviously it was, as history has been on to tell. And the bigger picture that we're getting now, so, Sega of America asked Sega of Japan to postpone Saturn in the West for a year and release 32X. 32X fails and costs Sega Corp money. Consumers are aware of Saturn and simply refuse to buy it after that initial kind of launch buzz that we've spoken about on Saturn year one. We've mentioned kind of 32X sales and stuff like that. SOJ then, in a response to the lack of sales and the loss of income, demand that Saturn be launched in May 95 at E3. Sega of America have claimed that Sega of Japan obviously forced them to launch it early, when all Sega of Japan have really done is give Sega of America something that they actually can sell, because they're not able to. These 32Xs, we've seen that in the leaked documents, they were scrap value in them.
Oh, God.
So and I think that panic that was created by the financial losses, mate, it led to Saturn being launched unprepared in the West. There was no development tools, retail support was gubbed, there was no hype, no marketing. And I think Sega of Japan need to carry the can for allowing the panic to set in, and just, if they'd stuck to the original plans, to release in September, things may have went a bit smoother, but that panic, SOJ have got that blood in their hands. They rushed it.
So there is culpability everywhere for this one, and I know we want to try and keep this short, so I'm going to try not to dwell too long on here. But there's a lot that's unsaid in here. And if you take the interview from Irimajiri at face value, if you combine it with what Nakayama said, as you say, Nakayama is a lot more that it was an agreement. Irimajiri makes it feel like he was strong-armed by Joe Miller and Tom Kalinske into releasing the 32X. I think if you read his quote, he's like, oh, they wanted to utilize the Genesis, they didn't want to abandon the installs, so they asked for an add-on. And Nakayama, as we agreed, with an add-on. But if you look at the timelines, now obviously, if you look at the other side, Sega America have a different version of the story, which obviously you can imagine. It says that they were forced to release the 32X. And again, I think it's a case that both are true. And if you look at it, the truth sits somewhere in between.
Yep, right in the middle.
So Sega of Japan are like, Sega America didn't want to abandon the Genesis. They didn't want to abandon the 16-bit market, which we now know was shrinking at the time. Which confirms why, which shows why Sega of Japan wanted a console of that, because they were shit scared of the 3DO and Jaguar. As ludicrous as that sounds, they were shitting themselves. They did not want a 64-bit and 32-bit console to be out there when they've just got the Mega Drive. Sega have always, from the Master System Mark III, then the Mega Drive, and then obviously the Mega CD was brought out to kind of counteract the Mode 7 capabilities of Super Nintendo. They've always wanted to be technologically on top, and they do the same in the arcade. The Model 1 was a response to whatever the Namco board was that did Star Blade, and then Model 2 was a response to Ridge Racer. So Sega have always wanted to be on top, and that's why they wanted a new console to be out before the end of the year. And it's well documented. We've seen and we've heard the various prototypes that went around, the Mars, the Neptune, the Jupiter, they've all been around. So the story from the Sega America side is that there was like, we need to respond to the Atari Jaguar. We need a console out before the end of the year. Do you want Saturn? And there's an interview with Tom Kalinske saying we could release a 32-bit console this year, but consumers aren't going to want to pay $399 for a console, which not too long before that, the 3DO was selling for $699. So I think Tom may have misjudged the market a little bit for that one. But anyway, he didn't want to send out such an expensive piece of hardware at the time, and he didn't want to sacrifice Mega Drive owners. So they obviously had other projects in hand, one of which was, as we know, Mars, which was a cartridge-based 32-bit system built on top of the Mega Drive chipset. And that's where Joe Miller had said, absolutely no way. If we put that one out, we will kill our market. If you're going to do this, you might as well make it an add-on. And thus the 32X was born. The 32X was born from Joe Miller rejecting a whole other console and opting for an add-on. And I think it was a quote from Michael Latham that says they had two shitty options, and he opted for what he thought was the less shitty one. So Sega of Japan were kind of forcing their hand on Sega of America at that point. I mean, Sega of America really shouldn't have been dictating what hardware they were getting, and I think I've said that before. They didn't dictate the Mega Drive or Genesis. That came to them as it was. And they should have just said, right, you want us to sell the Saturn? We'll sell the Saturn. But they didn't. They said, push the Saturn back a year. And thus, the 32X was born. So, as I said, both sides are equally culpable there. In my interpretation, not just taking this interview, but taking everything else, I know there's been a lot of, and this is a point I want to kind of make at the end of this, there's been a lot of veracity around what a lot of people are saying about certain people are liars and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think these people are lying. I think there are elements that are clearly being left out of the Irimajiri interview, but he is right. Sega of America, in my opinion, my recent opinion has been we should have had a worldwide Sega Saturn launch in 1994. And the world could have been very different then. But the 32X, they're all culpable for it. It's all their fault, and it's not that there's a blame game. I say fault. Everyone wants to point out it was Tom's fault, it was Nakayama's fault. It was just Sega trying to make sense of an industry which was changing at a pace that we haven't seen before or since, at a very transitional time, in terms of hardware, in terms of the players in the key players. You had Sony coming in, sprites going to 3D, cartridges going to disc. It was there. We'd never seen so much upheaval. We had, and Saturn came third in a generation that had about 7 or 8 different machines, if you count the Amiga CD32, the Neo Geo CD, the Apple Pippin, the Bandai, whatever it is, the Atari Jaguar, the 3DO. So there was an awful lot going on there. And this was just Sega of America and Sega Japan trying to formulate the best way to react to an environment that they couldn't really predict. So yeah, that's my key point. I could talk about this point forever, but I think that's my key takeaway there. And yeah, again, I don't think it tells us anything that we didn't already know. It certainly gives us an insight into how Sega of Japan feel about this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't think it's as much of a smoking gun. I think the last point is probably going to be the smoking gun, which is brand new information. But this again, kind of reaffirming stuff that we suspected, gives you an insight into how Sega of Japan view things. Probably getting fed up with the mud being thrown the other way when they're just as Sega America is just as much to blame. But so yeah, it's an interesting insight into what they thought.
That's it, mate. I think we've always, as you said, had that kind of SOA view.
Yeah.
But now we're finally getting the other side of the coin, so to speak. And you're right, it's like there are no lies here. There's just events which unfolded in these individual people's lives as being within the industry at that point. And the truth, as you say, lies somewhere in that kind of grey area in the middle. Decisions made, you're right, both sides culpable. The pace of the industry changed what it was. You absolutely, we've spoken about it so many times. It's never been the same since. Everything's nice and plateaued, standardized now. But back then it was just like change, change, change. I mean, you go for a job interview and people say, "Can you adapt to change?" Man, these guys must have been able to adapt to change at
Oh God.
a hell of a pace because I just think that the I think SEGA of America, what you said was an interesting point about, that they had previously been given the hardware. So SEGA of Japan done the hardware, says to SOA, who are a subsidiary, this is what we're giving you, launch it, market it, sell it,
Yeah.
right? It's almost as if maybe SOA, because they made it a success and SOJ never did, like the Mega Drive wasn't a success in Japan,
Yeah.
did SOA, again surmising, see the Genesis as theirs? We've made this a success. We've built this up. We don't want to let it go. And it was that kind of all of a sudden they felt they could stand up to Japan and say, no, we want to stay with this rather than do what we did before, just taking what you give us and selling it again.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that Sega of Japan have got previous for this. So if you look over in the consoles released in the West, 1986 Master System, 1989 Mega Drive, 1991 Mega CD, Game Gear, 1994 32X, 1995 SAM. You look in Japan, 1984 Mark 1, 1985 Mark 2, 1986 Mark 3, 1987 the Master System is re-released. So the Master System in Japan is it's an augmented Mark III. It's basically a Mark III with stereo sound. So this is them relaunching basically the same console, but with augmented capabilities. Almost sounds like that console they were trying to get SEGA of America to sell. 1989, the Mega Drive, codenamed the Mark V, by the way, because almost annually they've released new hardware. And Sega America are like, well, we tried the Master System in '89. That didn't quite work. We got the Mega Drive 3 years later, and we're making that a success. Don't try and force your annual console revisions that keep failing in your homeland onto us. That's just a theory. That's just a theory, but I think that may have been how they felt. I mean, if I was Sega of America and looking at the Sega Japan hardware churn, you'd kind of think we don't want that over here, kind of degrading our product. And I think that's what they were worried about. And ultimately, that's what did happen, is that the perceived value of their product in the public eye was massively diminished. But yeah, I think it's hard. And that, again, they're all of them, Sega Japan, Sega America, Tom, Joe Miller, Nakayama, Irimajiri, they were all trying to make sense of the absolute chaos around them the best way they could. And I think they were all kind of protective of what they perceived as dangers on the other side. That's just my view on this.
Well, I agree with that, mate. I think that's a fair take. But again, we didn't want to turn this into like another hour and a half.
No, that's what I said. So I was thinking to move on, because I could go on about that point forever.
And that was the one that when I was reading it, that I had taken the most kind of down from. So I thought that would be the kind of meatier bit. But the final bit was SEGA of America's finances and Tom's resignation. So Irimajiri had revealed that large retailers such as Toys R Us and Walmart would buy large bulk quantities of stock. However, if they didn't sell within a certain period of time, they'd send it back, or to make the point more clear, they would actually require Sega to buy it back. So straight away, you're making a loss.
Yep.
He goes on to say that all of Sega of America's profits in 1993 were, quote, washed away because of the extraordinary losses taken on return stock, which he puts at around $100 to $200 million at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Irimajiri also said that US retailers held a lot of power. And this really, I thought this was really baffling. Like, they require the manufacturers of technology or hardware to have a certain amount of inventory on hand to replenish stocks when it sells out. He claims that US retailers required SOA to have at least 500,000 Genesis systems on hand for restocks, or the retailers just simply wouldn't do business with them. He says that SOA had an excess of inventory that had to be sold at once, bringing in huge revenue, but then that inventory would come back from retailers later, and SOA would then have to take that on as a huge loss. With Genesis, those losses began to appear in 94, 95, and 96, and the combined number from all 3 years would, according to Irimajiri, be astronomical. Irimajiri said that while SOA had a reputation for earning so much money, it turned out they weren't earning anything at all, and things had to change. Tom was given 1 year to resize the company, which was a hell of a request. In 1996, the restructuring hadn't gone at all to plan, and SOJ was they ordered Irimajiri to take over as president, with Tom Kalinske asked to step down. Now, that was massive because I think we've all held the view that Tom got fed up with, SOJ interfering and taking away his control.
The very next podcast, which is the Sega Saturn Shiro Sega Guys crossover, in which we go through the document, because I was obviously listening to the draft earlier at the time of recording. There's a point where San Dave goes, if you're Tom, you stand. No wonder he got fed up and quit. Everyone thought this. I mean, technically he did quit, but he was asked to quit. That's the thing.
Jump before you're pushed.
Oh, exactly. That's exactly what my notes say.
Is that? There we go. That was massive. That was really eyebrow raising, I think, for me, because we've all held this kind of view that because of SEGA of Japan's interfering, forcing him to launch Saturn early against his will, against his better judgment, helping to make it a failure. The rollout, we've seen Pandemonium's video where Saturn wasn't really out there. It was like launching state by state on a 3, 4, 5 day basis. So we thought he just had enough. My control's been taken away. You've diminished my responsibility. I've had enough. I've done what I can. Thanks, guys. I'll see you later. No, he was given a year to resize the business and get it back on track, and he couldn't do it. And he was asked to step down, which is quite a change of tone.
It is. It does reframe his leaving of the company. I get the feeling, and I think we've got the Shiro interview coming up on the channel. I don't think we'll spend an awful lot of time in this, but we've got the Shiro interview going up where we talk about the documents that are in there. And also, obviously, we've got year 2, which is going to be absolutely enormous. Saturn year 2 we're going to talk about this in a lot more depth because this is obviously 1996. But it does reframe it. And you get the feeling that from a lot of Tom's emails that he really was pushing. He really wanted Sega to succeed. And I think we were saying, April, March, when he was sending these emails, we got to be a success like Sega Japan are with the Sega Saturn. I wish we could show that at E3. Why aren't we pushing the Nomad for Father's Day? We're trying to do all this. And you get the feeling he really wants the company to succeed. And I think we felt like this wasn't a man that sounded like he was just going to jump ship in a couple of months. And obviously that wasn't the case. But you kind of get the feeling that he wanted to stay, but then he kind of, despite what all the narrative around it was before, I think it's built up the fact because it was the old look. If you quit, we won't fire you. You can get a good reference from us, sort of deal. Because it's always been that sort of story, and he's kind of built on that. Because it's been a version of the truth, of course. It sounded like he left Sega because he had enough, but I think the evidence in the emails and the document leaks suggest that he really was trying to push it to be a success, and obviously was asked to leave when it was failing. And I still feel for the guy a lot because you can see he really was trying. I mean, the Nomad email, when he's saying we need to market it, and they're saying, Tom, I don't know what to tell you. There's no money left. You've cut so many corners, got no budget, which is obviously due to the restructuring hinted at in here, where they're saying you can't spend all this money on marketing. Your marketing budget's been cut. Again, we see it in the documents. You've got Sony have 100 billion to spend. So say you have like 10 grand or whatever it was. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but you can kind of see that there, and I think that kind of plays in to the restructuring of it all. And as for the unsold stock, this talks about the Mega Drives. It doesn't talk about the 300,000 32Xs with Star Wars Arcade and the other 200,000 with Virtua Fighter that are sitting in the stock either waiting to be sold for $29 or change or turned into scrap. It doesn't talk about the 3 million copies of Sonic 2 that are unsold sitting in the inventory and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the outlook was bleak, and I think it was very much a case that they had their peak post Sonic 2 in 1993, where Sega were on top of the world. They still maintained a pretty big market share in the 16-bit arena. Again, I think I mentioned it. We mentioned in year one that they had a lot of market share, and they did, but that market was contracting, I think, is the bottom line there. It wasn't that they were losing out to Nintendo all of a sudden, although that did happen after this year, or it happened in '96. It wasn't that they're losing out to Nintendo, it's that the market as a whole was contracting until then Nintendo started beating them, and they were getting absolutely trounced by the PlayStation, and the 32X was failing, and no one was buying Game Gears, and that was sitting in warehouses everywhere, and it was a pretty hopeless scenario.
I mean, the thing I was always wondering as well is that you look at those emails, right, and you're right, it doesn't come across as like I think given Tom's experience in business, he would never come across as maybe if he was desperate internally, or feeling the pressure, he would never show it kind of externally. But I mean, people that know us, we've got a lot of time for Tom, and not just because he's came on the show, twice, but he's always came across, as he's always tried to do his best by Sega. So you can see that those emails and the leaks, this is a guy, I think, when you now combine it with this was a guy who was literally, I think Saturn Dave called it a Hail Mary. This was Tom Kalinski's Hail Mary. He threw every bit he could into that, looking to do the kind of Father's Day stuff, let's look at Japan, let's look at what they're doing. I've went over there and visited, and they're selling out systems, and Virtua Fighter 2 is doing great, and it just wasn't enough at the end of the day. But one thing that I thought was, in the leaked documents, again, we'll not dwell on it too much because we do cover it a lot in the Shiro crossover, but was the scrap value they looked to get for, it mentions 32X, they might well have looked at it for other systems as well, but the scrap value, was that some kind of desperate, how can we claw something? Because we sold all these consoles, we've had to buy them all back at a loss from retailers. How can we recoup something back? Was that potentially part of that resizing to try and bring in some kind of income to sell these 32Xs as scrap? It's just so much that last one was really, really telling.
Yeah, just paints a very bleak picture. I think a lot of people have said it. Bernie's line, "The Saturn is not our future." I mean, look, I think I saw a few people say on Twitter that it reframes it. I don't think it does. I think, look, at the time, the Saturn was getting trounced, and we knew it was getting trounced. And I think we've done previous episodes before where it could have continued. Obviously, now knowing what we know it couldn't.
No.
I think even when Bernie said it, I don't think many people would have said he's wrong. But the issue has always been that he said it publicly. Which killed the Saturn. The Saturn was getting a tiny little bit of momentum at that time. Very small, with price cuts, which probably weren't sustainable. So you got to wonder what the appetite would have been for that, to continue with that. But yeah, after he said that was basically the death knell for the Saturn. So it's not that he was wrong. It's just that he shouldn't have said it. But there we go.
I think I've seen a few folk, as you've alluded to there, mate, saying that it kind of reframes it and puts it in a whole new context. You're right, he shouldn't have said it publicly, but this was probably, I mean, we've seen how Bernie's, I still see Bernie as the undercover Sony agent. He came and said, "I'm sorry," he said no RPGs, and then he launched Final Fantasy VII. He got that for PlayStation before he came to Sega. Come on, man. But, he shouldn't have said it, and I think he's that kind of character that he was. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he maybe was that kind of character where he was quite blunt. I think, he's probably seen all these kind of numbers. Like, he's come in and he's taken a look at the sheet and probably.
Oh God, he's seen what we're seeing now.
Aye, that leak is pretty much what he's looked at.
This is business as usual.
He's like, well, this isn't our future, but don't go EGM and say it, So aye. quite clearly it wasn't, but
Yeah, I suppose you can't begrudge him for speaking his mind and being candid and honest, which a lot of people aren't. I think that's a lot. If that's something that people have accused other members of Sega of America of, and I think that's kind of. And this is something that I had a point that I wanted to make is that there does seem to be this energy in the community, and I think we feel it as lovers of Sega and people that grew up with Sega and that loved Sega back in the day, and that were heartbroken when they stepped out of the hardware business. I think we spend a lot of the time. We do spend a fair few conversations talking about what could have been and what could have happened, and trying to make sense of what happened. Why did the history transpire the way it did, and consign Sega to that fate. But it does seem like now that this has come out, it seems like a lot of the community, a lot of the retro Sega community, or at least certain pockets of it, are trying to apportion blame to Tom and Sega of America. Now it's, Tom has lied, Tom was covering up what was happening here, and that maybe that's the kind of the rebound to so many years where we had the Sega of America side of the story. But it's like I said, the truth is that, well, the truth probably lays in between, as you said, the shades of grey. The fact that Irimajiri didn't mention that they're the ones that suggested the 32-bit cartridge console, which Sega America counted with the 32X add-on. It's just things like that. So there's various parts left out of both sides of the stories. The 32X on the Japanese side being suggested by them. Tom saying that he quit rather than with being asked to quit. No one is lying here. It's all just different people's versions of the same story. And I think you kind of have to piece it all together and look in between to kind of understand it. But it's not about apportioning blame. And I think that what people have got to quite understand is, like I said, it is things that happened 30 years ago. People, these individuals are 60, 70, 80 years of age now, trying to remember this stuff. And at the end of the day, they were all doing what they thought was right for Sega. These guys loved Sega like us. They continue to love Sega like us. That's why they talk about it so fondly. That's why Tom and Al come on and talk to not just us, but Sega fans in general. It's why Irimajiri and Nekiyama and Hideki Sato are still giving interviews, because they love the company so much. And I think it's part of the Sega community need to do is just accept that this was the way that things landed, and it hurts. It hurts me. It hurts you. It hurts to think about it. But I don't think it helps to blame and say this is all the times that I've caught Tom Kalinske distorting the truth. That doesn't help anything. Tom loved Sega, still loves Sega, and all of them did what they could at the time. Unfortunately, in a very turbulent moment of change, they made a lot of the wrong decisions, and against a very strong upcoming competitor. But yeah, this is a company that we love, and these are people that they made some mistakes, but they're still heroes to us. So it's fascinating to get this insight now and to have this understanding. That shouldn't paint your view of individuals in any sort of way. It just gives us fresh insight into what the world was like then.
Yeah. I mean, and as it's an almost kind of tragic book ending, almost to like a chapter that has always seen a lot of debate, as you say, a lot of debate, a lot of chatter, a lot of appropriation of blame, as you said. So I think this kind of the leaks and this kind of Sega of Japan side of things, it's almost like the proof that the iceberg sank the Titanic. It's like it's for so long, it's like you kind of wondered, and you've heard hearsay and myths and all this kind of stuff, and now you're finally starting to see different bits of the picture coming together where you can now start to see what went wrong, why it went wrong, and actually have some kind of factual basis behind it to look at. But there's no point, and it's maybe that kind of, like they call it the kind of stages of grief. It's like
it is.
It's like it's done, like appropriating blame to people. If you think Tom was at fault when he lied, what point is having a go at him on social media or a forum going to have now? It's not going to bring back what happened. You can't go back and change what's happened. Has happened. There's no point in getting. You can be philosophical and kind of sad about it. Things could have gone so different if only such and such had done this. But there's no point in getting angry. It's great to sit here and dig into it and actually look at it and analyse it. But we're just really fortunate that between the leaks and this. I'm sitting wondering what's going to come out next week, mate. It's like
Absolutely, it's brilliant to have this context and have this evidence, and it's great from a preservation of history perspective to give us the insight into the past. And yeah, it's gutting to see this company the way it was, but it's also absolutely fascinating to see where it was at the end and why things kind of happened the way they did. But mate, it's been fantastic running through all this. Obviously, we're going to go hell for leather for this in year 2. Expect that to be, it's going to take a while to sift through this in detail and to pull everything out. It's going to, imagine, I think you're going to be looking at adding year 1 and year 0 together to get to the length. But, it's been a blast just talking about this with you, mate. Viewers, listeners, if you enjoyed this, please let us know. Give us your thoughts on what you think of the leaks, what you think of the document leak. Keep your eyes peeled for the Shiro crossover in a couple of weeks, where we go through the document in a bit more detail and have a real laugh with the Shiro crew. We had a fantastic time making that one, so I'm hoping that you'll enjoy that. Do you want to see more Sega Guys news, more current events? I don't know, mate, could we do a few more, maybe once a month? Think about something, what's happening in the world of Sega today. Obviously, they're doing really well with modern gaming now, so that's an option as well. So let us know. Give us a comment below. Get in touch on Sega Media, social media. You can catch the account at Sega Guys. You can catch me at Swooper_D. You can catch James at the Segaholic. Subscribe, comment, keep in touch. You can find us here at the Sega Guys, and we will see you on the Sega side.
Sega.